Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now I think it's fair to say that the Metro games are some of the best looking titles ever released, not just on PC but on current generation consoles too. However, with excellent graphical quality comes demanding PC requirements, and to experience these games at their visual best means you'll need some beefy hardware under your desk. This is the second episode of PC Melters, the series where we take a look back at some of the most system-intensive games ever to release. Today, we'll be taking a look at Metro 2033, the first game in the series, as well as the overhauled Redux version, and talking about how well they run, or how not very well they run. So Metro 2033, originally released in March of 2010. This was a particularly interesting time for PC hardware because the GTX 480, Nvidia's first DirectX 11 graphics card, also made its way to market, and, coincidentally, it was listed as the optimum GPU to run Metro 2033, despite the game releasing about a week before the card itself. Other optimum requirements included a Core i7 and, I quote, as much RAM as possible. I remember a few reviewers calling this the underground version of Crysis. These days you can't buy the original Metro 2033 on Steam anymore, you can only get the Redux version, but for the purpose of this retrospective, I went out and bought a disc-based copy of the OG game. So let's take a look at how it runs on the GTX 480 first of all, the optimum graphics card. Bear in mind I am using a more modern processor, the Ryzen 5 2600X, and 16 gigs of RAM. I'm also running the game at 1920 by 1080. 1920 by 1200 would have been a more common choice 10 years ago. This is just for fun though after all. So anyone with a GTX 480 back in 2010 would have been fairly confident going into this game. After all, they had what was for a while the fastest piece of kit money could buy, and of course one of the hottest and most power hungry. Cranking the settings right up shouldn't have been of any concern in this GPU intensive game, right? Well, if you went into this title expecting to max it out with 60 FPS, you'd be disappointed. In fact, 30 FPS is a little way off with everything turned up. This is how Metro performs with the very high DX11 preset, as well as all advanced options and MSAA turned on. A few moments later, and the onslaught of enemies caused the GTX 480's fans to ramp up and our frame rate to drop. These settings are a little too high for the GTX 480 to handle, I'll admit. That might seem obvious, but you have to remember that this was one of the best single card solutions available at the time. Let's take a quick look at the underground performance during the start of this depot level 2. With little occurring on screen, the frame rate stabilises at around the mid-30 mark. This is the sort of figure you can expect to see when making your way to certain checkpoints before or after the fighting has stopped. When things start kicking off though, well, be prepared to drop to less than 20 frames per second. This scene is very taxing on the old Fermi beast. Even a modern CPU and 16 gigs of DDR4 can't save us in this situation. But I mean, we are trying to top out the settings after all. Now, we don't have to make too many sacrifices to see a huge FPS gain. The resolution itself can be kept at Full HD, and turning the preset down to high still looks nearly as good but does the GTX a huge favour. Tessellation and advanced depth of field have also been disabled. In return, this boosted the frame rate up to around 60. Again, there will certainly be some drops, but the result is much better. As you can see, the previously played opening level now runs a lot smoother, even with plenty of enemies charging toward us. The 1% and 0.1% figures are also better, and it's an all-round more enjoyable experience with a lot less stutter. Heading back to the underground level, and the same can be said. If I owned a GTX 480 back in 2010, these are the settings I probably would have used, if I had a decent CPU as well, of course. There are still a few drops to the mid-40s, but at the opposite end of the spectrum, the frame rate will reach at least 90 in some parts of the game, maybe even touch over 100. In 2020 though, All of the above information is irrelevant. Ignore it all, forget it, because just like with The Witcher 2 that we looked at last time, Metro 2033 received an enhanced version, along with its eventual successor. That was of course Metro Redux, and it's the only version that online retailers such as Steam and GOG currently sell. It certainly looks different, but some people still prefer the original, which is fair enough. They both have their respective advantages and disadvantages, but how well does this copy of the game perform? Well, as it happens, our old friend the GTX 480 is also the recommended graphics card for this version of the game too, so why don't we start there? Okay, so if you try and run the game at max settings with SSAA enabled, it will be a disaster. SSAA, or Super Sampling Anti-Aliasing, renders everything internally at a higher resolution, then scales it down to fit your display, kind of like The Witcher 2's Uber sampling. The GTX 480 is certainly panicking at this point, and in fact it's literally screaming. If we disable SSAA but leave everything else on, then 30 FPS plus is doable. In fact, the Redux version of the game, with its fancier graphics and lighting effects, runs better than the original title. There are still a few drops, but the gameplay is a lot more stable overall. Taking a look at that underground level again, and you'll notice that despite keeping the settings on very high, we were able to maintain a 30 frames per second average with this old GTX 480. Some people have had different results when it comes to which version of the game runs better, the original or the Redux, but in this case it's the Redux, unless you enable the dreaded SSAA. So we've had a look at the older recommended graphics card and its performance with both titles, but what about newer hardware? Well, I have some sad news regarding my Vega 64. It's unfortunately come to the end of its life and suffers from regular black screens and graphical artifacts. So the next best thing currently in my possession is the GTX 1660 Ti, a modern day GTX 1070 equivalent that will run any new title with ease and even compare with the 1070 Ti in some cases. But how does it handle both Metro 2033 and Metro Redux? Well, let's start with the original game again. I've thrown in another level here just to mix it up a bit. As you can see, with the highest settings, the frame rate exceeds 60 FPS during this Dead City level, dropping below it at the very start but quickly stabilising. This is with the advanced options all turned on. If you have a modern card that is equal to a 1070 or better, you will have no problems with the OG game. The underground level is also very smooth with the 1660 as well. This isn't as much of a PC melter as the Witcher 2 Enhanced Edition, that's for sure, but at the time it came out, it certainly was. As for Metro 2033 Redux, the 2014 version of the game, the FPS will tank with SSAA enabled and set to the maximum because it's essentially rendering at 4K internally and then being scaled to 1080p. This is exactly like The Witcher 2. Nevertheless, we still saw at least 30 frames per second here, but we were far from hitting 60. The outdoor level ran fine, and as we went back to the tunnels, we just about hung on to that 30 FPS average at 1920 by 1080. There were some dips down to the mid-20s, and overall, yeah, SSAA is not your friend. Turning it off entirely and all is well. Look at the difference in performance. We've gone from the mid-30s on average to over 100. So there we have it. When it came out, Metro 2033 really got PC gamers worried about whether or not their PC could actually run it. For the best hardware of 2010, it would have been a struggle to hit a constant 60 FPS, especially with advanced settings switched on. The Redux version made some key performance improvements and made the game accessible to a wider audience, an audience with weaker systems. These days, the Redux version can still be considered rather intensive if you decide you want to enable SSAA, but honestly, the visual gains aren't worth the performance drop at 1080p resolution, at least not in my opinion. But I'd love to hear your opinions. How does the game run for you with SSAA enabled and set to max? Can your 2080 or 2080 Ti handle it with at least 60 FPS? Be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching another episode of PC Melters. If you enjoyed it, leave a like on it. If you didn't, leave a dislike. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all again very soon.